The wind was a blade against the mountain, sharpening itself on the granite peaks and screaming through the pines. Jedediah felt it in the bones of his cabin, a low groan of timbers that sounded like a dying man. For 5 winters, the sound had been his only company, a familiar and hollow friend. He sat by the fire, oiling the action on his rifle, the metallic clicks a counterpoint to the storm's fury. His face, etched with lines that spoke of sun and sorrow, was cast in the flickering orange light. A long silver scar cut a path from his temple to his jaw, a permanent map of a day he could never outrun. The world outside was a maelstrom of white, a churning chaos that erased the land, the sky, everything. It was a good night to be alone. It was the only kind of night he knew anymore. A sudden, frantic banging on his door ripped through the howl of the wind. It wasn't the rhythmic knock of a lost traveler. It was the desperate, arrhythmic pounding of pure terror. He froze, rifle in hand. No one came this high. No one survived this mountain in a storm unless they were already here. He rose, his movements slow and deliberate, the caution of a man who knew that whatever was outside, the mountain had already judged it. He lifted the heavy bar from the door, his knuckles white. The wind tore the door from his grip, slamming it inward with a crash. A blast of ice and snow flooded the small room, extinguishing half the lamps. And in the doorway, framed by the screaming white void, was a woman. She was more wraith than human, her clothes shredded, her face pale and gaunt, ice clinging to her hair like a crown of thorns. She wasn't alone. Huddled behind her, clinging to the rags of her skirt, were 3 children. The oldest, a boy of about 10, stared at Jedediah with eyes far too old for his face, his small frame rigid with defiance. A younger boy stood beside him, his gaze vacant and lost, his thumb wedged in his mouth. And clutching the woman's leg was a little girl, her face buried in the folds of the worn fabric. The woman took a staggering step forward and collapsed onto the floorboards. The children swarmed her, their silent fear a palpable thing in the suddenly quiet room. Jedediah stood over them, the rifle still in his hands, a ghost watching a tragedy unfold on his hearth. He saw the bruises on the woman's neck, the split in her lip. He saw the raw terror in the oldest boy's eyes, a mirror of something he once saw in his own. He kicked the door shut against the storm and barred it, the heavy thud sealing them all inside. He didn't say a word. He laid his rifle on the mantel, his back to them, and stoked the fire. Sparks flew up the chimney like fleeting prayers. He ladled stew from the pot hanging over the flames into 4 wooden bowls he hadn't used in years. He placed them on the floor, a careful distance from the huddle of shivering bodies. The woman, Elara, slowly pushed herself up. Her eyes met his for a fraction of a second. They were not pleading. They were the eyes of a cornered wolf, ready to fight to the death for her pups. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod toward the bowls and retreated to his chair in the shadows. He watched them eat. They ate like starving animals, fast and desperate, hands shaking. The oldest boy, Caleb, kept his eyes on Jedediah the entire time, guarding his family with a fierce, useless glare. The little girl, Leah, ate with her fingers, her face a mess of gravy and relief. The middle boy, Samuel, didn't eat. He just stared into the fire, his small body trembling. When they were done, Elara gathered the bowls. She approached him, her steps unsteady. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice a raw rasp. He didn't look at her. He just stared into the fire, at the memory of another woman, another child, consumed by flames. "There are blankets by the hearth," he said, his voice gravelly from disuse. Sleep, it was not a suggestion. It was a command born of exhaustion. He did not want to know their story. He did not want to know their names. Stories were burdens, and he was already carrying more than his share. For days, the storm raged, locking them in a world of timber and firelight. Silence was the primary language. Jedediah would wake before dawn, slip out to check his traps, and return with a rabbit or 2, his face caked in ice. He would drop the game on the table and say nothing. Alara would silently skin and cook it, her movements efficient and weary. She mended their torn clothes with a needle and thread she found in an old box, her stitches neat and tight. She was creating order in the chaos, a small act of defiance against the world that had tried to break them. The children were quiet presences. Leah would sometimes watch him, her wide, curious eyes following him as he cleaned his rifle or carved a piece of wood. Caleb remained a sentinel, his hostility a shield around his family. He often stood between Jedediah and his mother, a small, unyielding wall. But it was Samuel who haunted the spaces between them. The boy never spoke, not a single word. He moved like a shadow, his eyes holding a deep, ancient horror. Sometimes, Jedediah would catch the boy staring at the scar on his face, his expression unreadable. One evening, Jedediah sat sharpening his knife, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone filling the room. Leah crept closer, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. She stopped just beyond his reach and pointed a small finger at the block of pine he'd been carving. He paused, looking down at the half-formed shape of a bird. He hadn't consciously decided to make it. His hands had just remembered the motions. He worked the knife again, shaving off a delicate curl of wood to form a wing. He didn't look at her, but he felt her presence, a small warm spot in the cold room. He finished the bird, sanding it smooth with a piece of leather until it felt warm and alive in his palm. He held it out. Leah looked from the bird to his face, then back again. Slowly, she reached out a tiny hand and took it. She clutched it to her chest and scurried back to her mother, a treasure secured. Alara met his gaze across the room. For the first time, the fear in her eyes was tempered by something else. A question, a flicker of gratitude. He looked away, back to the fire, the heat on his face doing little to warm the ice within him. The slow thaw began not with words, but with routines. Jedediah started leaving an extra piece of wood by the hearth for the children to draw on with bits of charcoal. Alara began to hum a quiet, sad lullaby as she put Leah to sleep. Caleb, seeing that the stoic man meant them no direct harm, finally lowered his guard enough to watch, fascinated, as Jedediah reset a dislocated joint on a trapped fox before letting it go. "Why?" Caleb asked, his first word directed at the man. Jedediah didn't look up from the fox as it scampered away. Broken things can be fixed, the words hung in the air, meant for more than just the animal. One night, a scream tore Jedediah from a fitful sleep. It was Alara, thrashing in her sleep, her hands held up as if to ward off a blow. "No," she whimpered, her voice thick with terror.
No, Silas.
There my children Caleb and Leah were awake, huddled together, the boy trying to soothe his mother. Samuel was rigid, his eyes wide, staring at a corner of the room as if the devil himself stood there. Jedediah moved from his cot. He didn't touch Alara. He knelt by the fire and placed a fresh log on the embers. He blew on them gently until a flame caught, casting a warm, steady light through the cabin. The light seemed to calm her. Her thrashing subsided, replaced by shuddering sobs. He returned to his cot without a word. The name Silas was a stone dropped into the quiet pool of their existence, the ripples spreading into every corner. He now had a name for the bruises, for the fear. He understood he hadn't saved them from the mountain. He had only offered them a temporary reprieve from a man. The next day he found Caleb trying to chop wood with an axe far too big for him. The boy struggled, his face a mask of frustration. Jedediah walked over, took the axe, and split a log with a single, effortless swing. He then handed Caleb a small hatchet. "Start with this," he said. "Balance, not strength." He spent an hour showing the boy how to stand, how to swing, how to let the weight of the tool do the work. It was the longest they had ever spoken. Caleb, his face flushed with pride and effort, finally managed to split a small log cleanly. He looked up at Jedediah, a flicker of a boyish grin touching his lips before he suppressed it. Jedediah felt an unfamiliar ache in his chest, a ghost of a feeling he had long since buried. He was teaching another man's son. He was standing in a place he thought he'd never be again. That evening, As Alara served the stew, she paused by his chair. His father, she began, her voice barely audible. Silas. He never taught him anything but fear. Jedediah continued to eat, his eyes on his bowl. He'll learn, he said. It was a promise. The storm finally broke. Sunlight, pale and thin, streamed through the cabin's single window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The world outside was pristine and white, beautiful and treacherous. The reprieve was over. Alara knew it. He saw it in the way she stood by the window, her hand pressed against the cold glass, her gaze fixed on the valley below. He will come, she said, not looking at him. A man like Silas doesn't let go of his property. You're not property, Jedediah said, the words tasting foreign on his tongue. She finally turned to face him, her eyes searching his. To him we are. He bought me. He believes that gives him the right to own my children. The ugliness of it settled in the room, thick and suffocating. Jedediah looked at his hands, calloused and scarred. They were hands that had taken life in a war he no longer remembered the reasons for. They were hands that had failed to pull his own family from a burning home. He looked at Samuel, who was tracing the outline of the wooden bird on the floor. He looked at Leah, asleep by the fire. He looked at Caleb, who was watching him, waiting. He walked to the wall where 2 rifles hung. He took down the older one, a Kentucky long rifle his father had given him. He held it out to Caleb. You know how to chop wood, Jedediah said. Now you'll learn how to shoot, for 2 weeks. An uneasy peace settled over the mountain. Jedediah taught Caleb to track, to shoot, to be silent in the woods. He was a harsh teacher, but a patient one. He was shaping the boy into a survivor. Alara, in turn, brought a semblance of life to the barren cabin. She found wild herbs under the snow and made a tea that soothed the rasp in his lungs. She organized his meager supplies, turning the cluttered space into a functional home. One afternoon, while Jedediah was showing Caleb how to read the tracks of a deer, Samuel tugged on his sleeve. The boy pointed toward the cabin, then put his hands over his ears and shook his head violently. Jedediah understood. He looked toward the cabin, saw Alara standing in the doorway, her face ashen. She was holding his old spyglass. She didn't need to say anything. He took the spyglass, raised it to his eye and scanned the valley floor. He found them easily. 3 riders, dark specks against the endless white, moving steadily up the trail. Silas. Jedediah lowered the spyglass. The time for running was over. The mountain had delivered them to his door, and now it had delivered their demons. Alara, he said, his voice calm and steady. Take the children to the root cellar. Bar the door from the inside. Do not come out. No matter what you hear, her eyes filled with terror. But she nodded, a soldier receiving her orders. Caleb, you're with me. The boy's face was pale, but he stood tall, clutching the small rifle. No, Alara cried, grabbing Caleb's arm. Jedediah, please. He's just a boy. He's a man today, Jedediah said. His gaze locked on the approaching riders. Go. Now Alara hesitated, her heart tearing in two. She looked at Jedediah, at the hard certainty in his eyes. She kissed Caleb's forehead, her lips trembling. Be brave, my son. Then she grabbed Leah and a silent, terrified Samuel, and disappeared into the cabin. Jedediah and Caleb took up positions behind a rocky outcrop that overlooked the path to the cabin. The wind was still, the world silent save for the crunch of snow under the hooves of the approaching horses. You see the one in the lead? Jedediah murmured, his voice low. That's Silas. He is mine. The other 2 are yours. Don't fire until I do. Aim for the chest. And don't miss. Caleb nodded, his breathing shallow. He rested the rifle on the rock, his small hands surprisingly steady. The riders drew closer. Jedediah could see Silas's face now, cruel and arrogant, a sneer plastered on his lips. He was laughing, talking to the men beside him. They thought it was a hunt. They were right. The riders stopped 20 yards from the cabin. Alara! Silas's voice boomed, a foul sound in the pure mountain air. You can't hide from me, girl. I've come to take back what's mine. Silence answered him. Silas dismounted, a heavy pistol in his hand. Fine. We'll do this the hard way. Jedediah raised his rifle. He centered the sight on Silas's chest. He exhaled slowly, the world narrowing to a single point. He thought of his wife, Sarah. He thought of his son, Thomas. He thought of the fire of his own failure. This time he would not fail. He squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle shot echoed through the mountains like the wrath of God. Silas was thrown backward, a dark stain blossoming on his chest. Before he even hit the ground, Jedediah was reloading, his movements a blur of practiced efficiency. The other two men, stunned, fumbled for their weapons. A second shot rang out, smaller, sharper. One of the men cried out and clutched his shoulder, his rifle falling into the snow. Caleb's shot. The third man raised his pistol and fired wildly toward the rocks. Bark exploded from a tree near Jedediah's head. "Reload, son," Jedediah said calmly, raising his own rifle again. He fired. The third man dropped. The wounded man was on his knees, clutching his shoulder, his face a mask of pain and disbelief. He looked from his fallen companions to the silent rocks. He scrambled to his feet and ran, stumbling through the deep snow, back the way he came. Jedediah watched him go. He lowered his rifle. He looked at Caleb. The boy was shaking, his eyes wide with the shock of what he'd done. He had taken a man's life to save his own. Jedediah placed a heavy hand on his shoulder. "You did good, Caleb. You protected your family." He walked down to the bodies. Silas was dead. The other man was groaning, but his life was seeping out into the snow. Jedediah did not offer comfort or aid. He stood over Silas, the man who believed he could own another human soul, and felt nothing.
No satisfaction.
No relief, just a vast, cold emptiness. He turned and walked back to the cabin. The bar on the root cellar door lifted. Alara emerged, her face pale, Samuel and Leah clinging to her. She saw the bodies in the snow, the blood staining the white landscape. Her eyes found Jedediah. He was leaning against the cabin wall, his face gray. He slid down to the ground. A dark patch was spreading across his side. He hadn't even realized he'd been hit. Alara rushed to him. She tore open his shirt, revealing a ragged wound just below his ribs. It was bad. "Caleb," she commanded, her voice firm, the fear replaced by a fierce resolve. "Bring me the hot water from the fire, and the whiskey from that bottle." Now, for a day and a night, she tended to him. She cleaned the wound, stitched it with her mending needle and thread, and packed it with herbs. She forced broth and water between his lips. The children watched, their small faces etched with worry. Samuel sat by Jedediah's side, never leaving, and placed the small wooden bird on his chest. During the worst of the fever, Jedediah drifted. He saw Sarah's face in the flames. He heard his son crying his name. But this time another voice cut through the nightmare. A woman's voice, soft and steady. "You will not leave us," Alara whispered, her hand on his forehead. "You will not." He woke to the smell of pine and clean linen. The fever had broken. Alara was asleep in a chair beside him, her head slumped forward in exhaustion. Caleb was asleep at the foot of the cot, the hatchet resting by his side. Leah was curled up with her mother. Samuel was awake, watching him. Their eyes met. The boy opened his mouth. A small, raspy sound came out. "Bah!" The word was a fragile miracle. It hung in the quiet room, more powerful than a gunshot, more healing than any medicine. It was forgiveness. It was a beginning. A tear traced a clean path through the grime on Jedediah's cheek. Spring came to the mountain. The snow melted, feeding rushing creeks and revealing a carpet of green. The air was filled with the scent of damp earth and new life. Jedediah's wound had healed, leaving another scar to add to his collection. But this one felt different. It didn't feel like a punishment, felt like a price paid. He stood on the porch, watching Caleb and Leah chase butterflies in the meadow. Caleb was smiling, a real, free smile. Alara was tending a small garden they had tilled together, her hands in the rich soil. She looked up and saw him watching, and her own smile was a sunrise. Samuel came and stood beside him, slipping a small hand into Jedediah's large, scarred one. "Pa!" he said, his voice stronger now. "Caleb says we can go fishing." Jedediah looked out at the vast, beautiful, and broken landscape that was his home. It wasn't empty anymore. He squeezed Samuel's hand. "He's right," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he was just now relearning. "Let's go get the poles."